Okay. Good afternoon, Excellencies, distinguished guests, participants, delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back from lunch. It seems some people enjoyed the lunch more than others, so they may have to explain themselves in a moment. But those who have been here even before 2 o'clock, we want to thank you again that you have been patient. I have nothing more to say now than to say we are going to start the high-level leadership roundtable. The theme for this event this afternoon is priorities for South-South cooperation in the context of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To take us through these discussions for the next hour or so, let me introduce you to the moderator for this high-level leadership roundtable, the Deputy Director of the UN Office for South-South Cooperation, Inyang Ebong Hastrop. Madam Moderator, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to take the responsibility for appalling manners and for keeping you all waiting. It's just when you're with a lot of high-level people, it's kind of hard to maneuver them. But by the end of it, I was getting the cars and getting my guys into the cars. So we're all very, very sorry, aren't we? Yes. Okay. And so we hope that what we will do this afternoon will probably be very exciting and very edifying. So before we start with what the session is about, I'd like to introduce my panel to you. Now, on my left, my immediate left, is Mr. Ibrahim Thiaw, Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. Next to Mr. Thiaw is Mr. Patrick Gomes, Secretary General of the African, Caribbean and the Pacific Group of States. Next to him is Mr. Gayan Chandra Acharya, Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and High Representative of least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. And next to him is Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, former Assistant Director General and Coordinator for Economic and Social Development in the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And finally, our wonderful host, Dr. Meshgan Alawar, Secretary General of Syed International Foundation for the Environment. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. And I think the whole audience is aware that in the most recent years, there's always been South-South cooperation. But I think that in 2008, when you had that magnificent, in some ways, financial meltdown in Europe and in the North, and with the growth that you saw in southern countries, of course, you had the BRICS, which were the big five, Brazil, India, China, South Africa. There was a great notion that the South had really come of age and come into its own. And we've seen that, for example, China has been able to launch 2 initiatives to the tune of 5.1 billion in terms of providing the South with support for the development goals and objectives, primarily meeting the SDGs. And in fact, in the 2 big major events in 2015, that's the Agenda for 2030 and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, South-South was front and center. It is clear that South-South cooperation is not seen as it's seen rather as complementary to North-South, but it is clear that it is having a spectacular way with other countries in the South through trade, investment, aid, capacity building, you name it, there's an imprint of South-South cooperation. So we thought that we would get together this leadership panel and explore, especially because the South-South cooperation agenda has now been so interwoven with huge development goals, namely the SDGs. How is it going to work? One of the first questions we want to ask, and I'll start with this to my panel members, and I'll start with Mr. Tiao. What are the priorities of South-South cooperation in the context of the implementation of the 2030 agenda?
Thank you very much. There are many priorities, but I will focus on two, since this is an afternoon session and I know everybody is tired. The first priority to me is clean technologies. You know, I don't know how many of you took the metro in New York recently. And since you are here in Dubai, I would strongly advise you to take the Dubai metro and just compare the two. I don't know how many of you are aware of the fact that renewable energy is now one of the main sources. The investments made in renewables last year surpassed the new investment made on fossil fuel-based energy. And the majority of that investment is not in the developed world, it is in the developing countries. So in terms of South-South cooperation, be it the solar technologies in China or the wind technologies in India, or be it the geothermal plants that have been built in Kenya, or if you think about the world's largest solar plant being built at the moment is in Morocco, then you realize that there is something happening there. So in terms of agenda for sustainable development, the way to transform the world will certainly depend on how much clean technology is being developed, especially in the area of energy. And that's how you can combine the agenda for sustainable development with climate change. The second area that I wanted to talk about is the area of green financing. Without financing, there will be no agenda for sustainable development. And when I say financing, I'm not referring to public financing only. Of course, it is important to have public financing, but I'm talking about the markets. I'm talking about, you know, the big business and the small business and how they would invest on the agenda for sustainable development. And if you think about the most innovative approaches to green finance, you find them in Brazil, you find them in South Africa, you find them in China, you find them here in Dubai. So there is something going on where probably I think the developing world is much more agile because precisely they are, you know, prompt to innovation than maybe some of the so-called old civilizations. So I think the green financing is another area where markets will react to the agenda for sustainable development, and that is what is going to make the big changes in the world. Yes, public financing is important. Yes, ODA is important, but these are tiny compared to the volume and the mass of financing that is needed for the agenda for sustainable development. And again, it is coming along. It is coming very quickly, and please watch it. It is not coming from the north, it is coming from the south. This is not to make an opposition between the north and the south, but just an observation that there is something going on which needs a little bit more attention than it is taking at the moment.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Mr. Gomez next, because I'm going in the order that you're in. May I ask you to limit your interventions to roughly about 3 minutes so that we can get all our questions in and get audience participation?
No. Thanks very much. Thank you indeed. In fact, I'll be forced to limit it to 2 minutes. For 2 points, I think that in talking about priorities, I think we want to do priority setting as the first priority, and priority setting at a national level, because my sense is that I am not able, from the African Caribbean Pacific group, to be as specific as Ibrahim is in identifying 2 areas, because we try to look at how we complement what is happening at the national level the regional level, and then an intra-ACP level. And that means that we want to be very conversant and very in tune with priorities that countries have set themselves. I think that was hammered home a lot, both in terms of the Paris principles about ownership of policy. Ownership of policy must come from the priorities that the countries set themselves. And we want to say, and we heard that shift certainly in Addis Ababa and thereafter, that countries are responsible for what they make of their own development in that sense. Now, some of that is good, but I think slightly dangerous if it's going to take off the hook those who have brought about the underdevelopment of the developing countries. In other words, we are not underdeveloped or developing countries just in a natural state. There has been a relationship of the developed world, or colonialism, imperialism, which made countries that are now considered developing, and if you think of the Incas of Peru and Aztecs in Mexico, they were far developed before anyone came as conquistadores. As you would know here, the civilizations that go back. So what I want us to come to is, how do we help in letting the priorities that are set by the national level become the basis or the ground on which we look at complementing other activities? And then we see the Agenda 2030 and the 17. Sometimes I get confused about all 17 of the goals. And if we attempt to do it in a menu, I have a big problem in picking and choosing from the menu rather than taking the priorities that are at the national level. Now, I think a lot of assistance can go where South-South cooperation comes, and the work we did in mapping is how do countries identify their needs in a particular sector? And that needs analysis that could be done, drawing on that experience, would help us to get the priorities clear, and then we can see where the interventions will come on and complement. And that's why the UN agencies like UNEP will play a very significant role, because they're also going to add to, and they bring value addition, and they bring their comparative advantage of having worked in certain areas to, in fact, make it possible for the priorities that have been set as priorities to be realized. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very important question. I think some issues have already been raised in the floor, but now I would like just to say that from the perspective of the least developed, landlocked and small island developing states, what they are really looking for in terms of the South-South cooperation, capacity building is one of the most important things they are looking for. They have a wonderful experience in terms of the poverty eradication, in terms of really structural transformation in these countries, as well as dealing with the poverty, the hunger, as well as malnutrition and the health-related challenges. Many of the countries from the South have a very good experiences of that. But how that can be really taken to these countries and adapted to their circumstances, but get the due benefit out of that, that's one of the most important things that these countries are really looking for. Second is the broad sense of finance. Of course, the finance will be very, very important for anything that we like to do, and that also brings the technology together with the finance. We have a lot of technology, but the proven technology sometimes cannot be simply transplanted in other country situations. There has to be built-in innovation to really make sure that those technologies are not only appropriate for these countries, but also affordable. And those are some of the very important issues that brings in the element of finance, technology, as well as the trade-related capacity building, trade relationship, I should say. So if you look at today, the LDC's trade partners, now it is the South which are the largest trade partners, going even beyond the North. But again, if you look at the balance of payment situation, but again, the relationship with the North will be critical. But you see the importance of the countries in the South also growing. And therefore, I would say two things. One, capacity building in terms of having an integrated policies in all across the areas. But two, the finance, including technology. Those are the two areas they are really looking for from the South-South cooperation. Thank you.
Yes, I see basically three issues which were not resolved last year in 2015. As you know, 2015 brought us the SDGs, but there was a failure to make progress at the Financing for Development Conference. And the biggest failure there was on tax cooperation. We cannot have a world where you have tax havens which allow countries to avoid not to be able to collect taxes, and this is especially important in developing countries, especially important, for example, in Africa, where there has been a net flow of funds out of Africa, which is far greater than the FDI, or for that matter, the ODA, which has been coming into Africa. The second major problem which we have from last year is the failure to make greater progress on the Doha development round. In fact, my fear right now is that the developmental aspects of the Doha round are going to be jettisoned in favor of bringing on issues which are much closer to corporate interests, particularly the strengthening of intellectual property rights, which will raise the costs of medicines, particularly to people in developing countries. Secondly, we are likely to see a strengthening of corporate rights at the expense of national judicial systems. And thirdly, and not unimportantly, a return to the kind of unrestrained financial globalization which led to the crisis which we experienced in Asia, for example, in 97, 98, and subsequently in 2008, 2009. The other set of issues, of course, are the ongoing issues as far as climate change is concerned. Two in particular, I think, need to be emphasized. Much, much more can be done as far as mitigation is concerned, and particularly, we have to recognize that there are almost 2 billion people in the world who do not have access to modern power, modern energy. And it is important to be able to ensure that they have access to modern energy, and this can be achieved by a strong trust towards making renewables affordable for all. The other issue, of course, is to make sure that the adaptation to climate change is a developmental agenda. And the countries which are unfortunately the most vulnerable are some of the poorest countries in the world, and much, much more needs to be done. And these two elements of the climate change agenda were not sufficiently reflected in the outcomes in Paris. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So finally, I am the last speaker in this leadership, and I want to just end with the leadership in Zayed International Foundation for the Environment. Since His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Vice President of United Arab Emirates, Prime Minister and ruler of Dubai, founded the Zayed International Prize for the Environment in 1999. He had a vision for this international prize to take forward the vision of the late father of the United Arab Emirates, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan, be mercy upon him, and took forward his legacy for working for the sustainable development since since establishment of the United Arab Emirates. And in that view and in that vision, we tried, when we set up this Zayed Prize, we tried to include all the stakeholders of the society, the global, since the international effect with the international leaders, and covering the scientific and technological achievements, plus the grassroots as well in the categories of Zayed Prize. Not only that, but as the priorities change over the years, we added also a new category to cover the youth, which is now on a national agenda for the United Arab Emirates, and we will be celebrating the first winners of the youth category, hopefully early next year. And in this inception, Zayed Foundation for the Environment also had a global partnership with different United Nations organizations, plus the other international on the national and regional as well. When we wanted, of course, and that comes with the power of the global coming in line with the UAE's vision for achieving the sustainable development as a desire to also take action now for a better and prosperous tomorrow. So I will end this thing to say that what we took action in Zayed Foundation and in Zayed International Prize for the Environment, that rise above stereotype, being given all the tools, we wanted just to achieve not to step back, but to look forward and have. Today we are celebrating our partnership with the Global South-South Office for Global United Nations Office for South-South, and we are having this historic event happening for the first time in the United Arab Emirates after it was only happening in the United Nations programs, organizations, and funds. So we are just looking forward to the fruitful deliberations and outcomes for the next 4 days to have strong outcomes and recommendations that will be taken forward to the next level in the United Nations, nationally, regionally, and internationally. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alawar. And in fact, you can see that United Arab Emirates is taking South-South very seriously, as well as the key issues of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sorry, our colleague just joined us right at the end. From OECD?
No, OIC Youth Forum.
OIC,
Yes,
okay.
Sorry,
Thank you. If you could just introduce yourself, please.
Elshad Iskandarov, Ambassador of Azerbaijan and the President of the OIC Youth Forum. Sorry, we had bilateral with the South-South, that's why.
Okay,
delayed.
thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I heard in our conversations, financing, and there are complexities in that financing. I had the privilege of going to a meeting at WTO. It was the first time I ever went there, and that was interesting because it was the LDCs there. And quite honestly, when you talk to a lot of the individual delegates, they weren't getting a break at all, especially in terms of their commodities and how they could develop value added around it, and then what they would be taxed in return. So that financing is a real issue. And the way we talked about technologies, and it's interesting that Mr. Thiaw said that technologies are in the South. I think that's very interesting because a lot of the times when I think of this renewable energy, I really do feel that the North will, because we don't necessarily produce ourselves, that we're constantly having to buy the technology. And that in itself has a cost, and I don't know the degree to which we're developing our own capacities and innovations. But my next question, and this is why I was interested that you all started off with financing, we asked what are the means of financing these priority areas and what innovative funding mechanisms should we explore? Now, Dr. Thiaw, Mr. Thiaw, you talked about green financing. I'm not sure quite what that is, so perhaps you can explain to us how that would further some of the SDGs. And then afterwards, I'll ask Dr. Jomo.
Thank you. First, on technologies, just to clarify, of course, there's no exclusivity from the South, but the reality today is that countries like China and India are actually manufacturing a lot of these clean technologies. And when I mention clean technologies, I'm not limiting myself to energy only. We are also talking about clean transport systems. We are talking about technologies for waste management. We are talking about technologies for water provisioning and so forth. So clean technologies that are compatible with the Paris Agreement are absolutely essential, and they are produced now both in the North and in the South. With regards to green financing, what we mean by green financing is essentially reorganizing the finance system. You know, in today's world, all incentives are for investments on brown technologies and fossil fuel technologies. And if you want to achieve the ambition of the Paris Agreement, you have to shift the financing from the old traditional technologies that are polluting and that have gotten us to where we are today to actually clean technologies that will help us achieve the Paris ambition. And that will not happen overnight. It will require new policies be set up by central bank systems and new policies set up by governments so that private sector companies, small and big, would actually have incentives to invest on clean technologies. So that's what we mean by green technology, because the implementation of the ambition of the Sustainable Development Goals and of the Paris Agreement will be achieved or not, depending on how much we are able to mobilize the markets. So they are much more important in terms of volume and transformative change than actually the public funding. Governments regulate. Governments do not have money. They collect taxes, but they collect taxes from those that are generating income. So it is important that as governments collect taxes, they also have policies, including policies of collection of taxes, that are compatible with the ambition of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. I'm referring both to the SDGs and climate. I should not, because actually the SDGs include climate. But since the Paris Agreement was signed after the adoption of the SDGs, we still have that duality. We have to recombine the two, because actually climate is part and parcel of the SDGs. Thank you.
Dr. Jomo, you made some very strong points about the failures in terms of the financing, the whole issue with taxation. How are we going to provide financing for priority areas? And I think we all agree it's technology. So how will we do that?
For the world today will be to ensure that governments are empowered to be able to finance selectively what they see as being their national priorities. Currently, governments are disempowered by the fact that there has been a very influential ideology over the last few decades which has disempowered governments by reducing their tax revenue. Trade liberalization, for instance, has meant that some of the poorest countries in the world who collected up to half of their revenue from taxes on imports now no longer have that tax revenue from those imports. So it's going to be extremely difficult for them to do very much. We have had situations where even basic agricultural research and extension work is no longer done in many developing countries because it is left very much to the private sector to sell fertilizers, to sell machinery, etc., without the government mediating and making choices as to what might be in the best interest of the farmers concerned. So you have a situation where governments basically do not have the resources, they are not able to invest, for example, investing in renewable energies does require resources. Not every country is similar. What the options which are available, which are suitable for a country like Nepal would be quite different for a country like Vanuatu, and so on. So you really need to be able to look, for example, at the options for wind power in Nepal, but perhaps tidal power or wave power in Vanuatu. These are the kinds of needs which are the circumstances which are very different, which need different types of financing. And since there is no global effort to undertake that kind of financing, it often falls on the governments themselves to do this kind of financing. And unfortunately, the poorest countries in the world, the least developed countries, are least able to afford that kind of work. But having that kind of government capacity is important, not only to undertake the kind of research and development work which I referred to, but also to build the capacities and capabilities which are so crucial for technologies to take root in the developing countries. So financing is absolutely crucial. In addition, of course, there's the need to be able to access financial resources from abroad, and this is why the climate finance facility becomes so crucial. And to ensure that the climate finance facility is one which is truly concessional for developing countries, rather than just one other market option available. And this, I think, these are some of the challenges which are very, very crucial for financing. Of course, there are a whole range of other things. The fact that many of the capacities which developing countries had have basically collapsed with trade liberalization. Developing countries in Africa, for example, Africa used to be a net food exporter. It is now a net food importer. Africa has deindustrialized over the last few decades. And how is Africa going to industrialize once again? These are all burning issues which many governments and peoples face all over the world, and finance is often crucial to the solution.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'd like to ask Mr. Acharya, because you have the least developed countries, you have the landlocked, and you have the small island states. And the picture that Dr. Jomo just painted was pretty bleak, and you have the hardest job managing that situation.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think just to give you some perspectives, if you look at the least developed countries, there are altogether about 48 countries, almost 1 billion population. And we all appreciated and celebrated that the global poverty level has been reduced by half. But if you look at these countries, they are still, we have the global poverty rate now about 10% globally. But if you look at these countries, they still have about 35 to 40% of the population below poverty level. That's a huge disparity that is there around the world in terms of the number of poor people in any country. Second point, I think we're talking about the resources. It's very important that, of course, the resources is one of the major issues. The capacity to generate resources within is very limited in the LDCs. They have made a lot of progress. If you look at the internal revenue to GDP ratio in these countries, it is still around 13-14% of the total GDP. I mean, if you want to really have a development pathways that you want to achieve in order to eradicate poverty, structurally transform their economy, you need at least 25 to 30% of GDP investment every year. You are nowhere near that. There is a huge gap between that. That's the reality of the LDCs. And I fully agree with what my colleague Zomo just said. If you don't have the other resources coming, if your structural transformation is not happening, if the overall contribution of the manufacturing sector, the economy is either standstill or it has even gone down, then you have to really look for other financial resources, including your capacity to generate more resources within, which is, having a better contract, especially in the industries which are extractive industries. This is one area we need to really work very hard on that. Second, how to really get the international finance on concessionally terms until you have the structural transformation of these economy. These are crucial issues. The North-South cooperation in terms of really getting a finance is critical, but equally important these days, if you look at the investment coming from the South, it is also helping a lot in order to really meet the investment gap. But it is not a question of this or that. It is a question of having more of all of that, because they have a huge way to really go to meet the the global goals. And I'll just give you other examples. If you look at the energy poverty, which is one of the highest in these countries, the people without access to modern energy, almost 2/3 of the people have no access to modern energy in these countries. And that's a very, very big number of people. And there is a huge gap in terms of infrastructure, water infrastructure, then again the health infrastructure. Therefore, what we are really looking for is a very dedicated financial mechanisms that can really take care of the huge development challenges these LDCs face. And that's what we are really looking for.
Okay, thank you very much. So you're saying that basically, and I think this is fair to say, that we're not saying it's either south-south or north-south. I think we're looking at the full basket, south-north, south-south, where we can get the best amount of resources to do the most amount of things. Now, I think it's fair to say that South-South cooperation is not without its challenges. One of the pet peeves I have is that when they think about South-South, they think about the big five, the BRICS, Brazil, India, China, as if there aren't other southern countries, like my own, that are growing and able to compete. So there are challenges. There are growing inequality, income inequality, especially in the middle and emerging economies, a disparity of economic performance amongst southern countries, especially those of small islands and least developed countries. And because we have our colleague from OIC, the one area, the one group demographic that causes us a lot of problems is youth. And so in all of these disparities, I would say the disparity of employment. People don't have employment, and the hardest hit are the youth. What can South-South do in addressing these challenges? I want to start with perhaps my colleague down there, because you just came. Perhaps you could speak to South-South youth and the challenges.
Yes. Well, when we talk about the projection of the goals or the targets of the SDGs in the region of the South-South, and then when it comes to its sub-region of the OIC member states, which, by the way, around 70% of the OIC's 56 member states are in the South-South category. So, and then from there, we go to the thematic field of youth development, the impact of cooperation on a South-South level rises as the avalanche, and I will try to explain why is it. So in SDGs, we have 5 different thematic issues or clusters where youth is the priority out of overall SDGs. When it comes to South-South cooperation, big chunk of the South-South countries are the countries members to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. When it comes to the challenges which the OIC countries are facing, these are mainly challenges of the future, challenges of the next generation, or challenges created by the agents of this future change which are used today. Let me just give you a couple figures, Out of 1.9 billion people, which are the population of the OIC countries, about 20% today are under the age of 20, and some 25% are under the age of 25. So it means that every 4th person in the OIC geography, and that's going, by the way, to rise up to 30% in 2050. So comparing with the developed countries, comparing with the global north, it is almost 2 times higher, this figure, which is average in the countries of the OECD is 12.4. So you see how the problem when it comes to the youth field in the particular area is being raised like the avalanche. Disparity issue, you touched the disparity and huge inequality between different countries of the South. So that's even more reflectory in the OIC region. Just 10 out of 56 OIC member states are in possession of the 80% of the combined GDP of the 56 countries. So again, the disparity when it comes to youth, it's with more burden use of the southern OIC countries, those with the booming youth generation. So where is the cross-cutting area here for cooperation, and how South-South cooperation can create added value for implementation of the global SDGs when it comes to the youth population of 56 countries. I believe that the silver bullet here is the youth employment. Although on 3 issues, all these 3, both OIC 10-year plan of action and the South-South goals and the SDGs agree, which is youth participation, education, and unemployment. But I believe that if we are taking the most important, ring of this solution, it's the youth entrepreneurship, and youth entrepreneurship in the IT sector. For this, just coming, that's the reason I apologize for me being delayed, signing the framework, strategic framework between the OIC Youth Forum and the South-South Office of the United Nations. The important part there is education and the talent. The youth is not just the challenge, or not just something which bring demographic and economic problems in the future, but also the huge potential and pool for the talent. Just signed on one of the projects, which is the OIC Startup Platform, the project which envisaged to multiple the talent of startup and the skills of talent on the mass basis, because young people tend to hire young people, and by this, hopefully, we are trying to contribute to a decrease of the unemployment, which is the starting point. But if we will have time, I will talk about some other steps as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I still would like to know, Mr. Gomes, how do you think South-South cooperation Can it even really address some of the growing inequalities, the income inequality, quality of life inequality? Can it really? I mean, they all...
I believe if we begin too much as if there's a pathology of development and we see problems, we're missing the boat on South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation is creative and innovative because it starts with things that have worked. It starts. And the link with technology has a link with youth. Youth is not the problem. Youth is the solution. We have a project called Cultures Plus. And rebranding the Africa Forum has allowed young people to come forward with how they can ensure that the vaccines being provided by the WHO or the PAHO are better protected in something they've designed using solar energy. We have the youth who have looked at what is happening in terms of the congestion and traffic in cities like Nairobi, etc., and said, we can design and have designed using electronic systems their own traffic signals, so that you can't even break the traffic signal. So I think we have to look at what I would feel is a South-South youth innovation entrepreneurship program. In other words, these are examples that are around the place and we don't accumulate them enough. But fundamentally, the question of development is a question of power and politics. As I think has been said, we have disempowered developing countries for hundreds of years, and we want to know why they're underdeveloped. Take, for instance, the simple thing about the illicit financial flows. Until we can come to grips with the terms and conditions under which investments are going to be made and how they will be regulated, and ensure that the percentage that goes out doesn't end up in the banks of the Western world and stay there. So we have to recover, we have to prevent the losses. Take a simple example of remittances. 4 times what is coming in ODA comes from remittances. How do we find, therefore, mechanisms for the bank charges and the transaction costs of the remittances of young people working? We see them working out there in the buildings. They're sending home to the Philippines, they're sending home to Pakistan, etc. But then the bank charges, the transaction costs are robbing them of it. If you go to MoneyGram or where else, 18, 20% is paid on it. It's outrageous. So we must marshal our policy issues to address the root causes of some of these issues, and then try to mobilize where success is and build that accumulative process. So I think some of it means us stepping back and rethinking development in those terms, rather than if it's a recipe that if you press a button for one item, it will solve it. So I'm just being a little provocative, but I think some of it could work.
Thank you. I like provocative. So those are the basic questions I had for our panel. We have a lot of issues around financing, capacity building, clean technologies, etc. And I would like to ask members of my audience, and we just had Mr. Gomes' last intervention, which was we have disempowered the developing countries for many, I shouldn't say we, because anyway, the developing countries have been disempowered for many decades now. So why is the South all of a sudden, South-South cooperation going to change all that? I will open the floor for about 5 minutes worth of questions, and then because we started late, I'm holding up my other colleagues, so I'd have to wrap up. Do I have any questions from the floor?
Thank you so much for granting us a very good opportunity to share with our local experience in Hong Kong. And I'm Shirley from Hang Seng Management College. And thank you for a lot of honorable speakers sharing about green finance and also forward management and priority setting. We just want to know more about how to teach our next generation when we integrate with the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, because they're so varied, depends on the local context. So I just wonder, forward management and priority setting, these 2 major themes, how are we going to put into the item number 4, quality of education, and 17, partnership? Just use maybe UN, you have so many agencies. How are you going to build the partnership so that we can build the awareness about the priority right now? You're talking about green financing or maybe green technology. So how are we going to learn about this, what we're supposed to do in our next maybe 2 years? Thank you so much.
Yes, I just wanted to thank the panel because I was really and positively impressed by your comments, especially about the fact that the South might have sometimes some kind of assets and atu and being sometimes a bit late or behind enable us to do things differently in an innovative way and also with maybe some sustainability in it and so on. And it's the first time that I hear that, and I am really happy. The second comment is that 9 November will be the day of usability. It's a United Nations Day, and maybe you know about it. Usability is something that means utility. It's something that means efficiency. It's something that means accessibility, but also kinds of apprenticeship and so on. I think that it's a bit similar to the South-South cooperation issues. It has to be accessible, it has to be robust, it has to be easy for people involved and institutions involved and so on. And since in November it will be the day of usability, I think that we will gain really when it comes to the priority of South-South cooperation to deal with South-South cooperation in this and with this methodology. Something that can be a bit different because we won't take the North-South cooperation as a model. We would like to do it in a different way, maybe in an accessible way for the whole countries, third countries, and it means that it can be accessible for them and it won't be only a matter of North-South triangular cooperation or simply the big five, as you stated before. Many thanks.
On my panel would like to tackle the question of forward management and priority setting in terms of the context of the SDGs and meeting the SDGs. Joma?
Thank you very much. Let me suggest that one important kind of mobilization which has an important educational component is the whole question of nutrition, which is in SDG 2. Nutrition is a multifaceted challenge. And of course, there is the traditional problem of hunger, but there's also an additional problem of what is sometimes referred to as hidden hunger, the lack of basic micronutrients, whether they are vitamins, minerals, or trace elements. And a new problem which has come up, which is estimated to cost about 5% of world income, is the problems relating to overweight, obesity, and other diet-related non-communicable diseases. These are huge problems, and they are fast-growing problems, including in developing countries. And we recently learned, earlier this month, that there has been a great deal of compromise of scientific knowledge. Up to recently, for instance, food companies were paying scientists from reputable universities to go around saying that sugar was all right, it did not contribute to cardiovascular diseases, and instead it was a problem of cholesterol for which pharmaceutical companies were producing statins. Now this is a very simple example of how knowledge, scientific knowledge, was compromised by corporate interests, and why it is essential that scientific knowledge be, in a sense, governments are empowered together with civil society to be able to check this kind of misleading information, misleading advertising, which has resulted in younger generations, for instance, often being overweight and obese and leading to non-communicable diseases. This is just one example because the SDGs cover a whole range of examples, some of which have been referred to, but of course there are other issues, and this is why education becomes extremely important and challenging, and very often it is a question of challenging the traditional sources of information. in this particular case, researchers who were working in reputable universities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jomo. I have been signaled by Mr. Acharya and Mr. Tiao. They would both like to address that question, but if you could keep it short.
Okay.
1 minute.
I say that, I think getting the students from the early age to really be sensitized about the integrated nature of sustainable development would be the key message that I would say. That when you look at development, it should be seen from the social perspective, economic perspective, as well as environmental protection perspective. I think the education plan can really play a very important role to really inculcating those concepts right in the minds of the students early on, because they are going to the future leaders. So I would say that advocacy of this integrated nature and transformative nature would be very important. Thank you.
I wanted to finish with just a little bit of hope, because there has been a lot of despair in the world and negative messages. The youth that is being portrayed now as a problem is actually one of the best assets that the world can have. But they have to be valued, because we talk as if the youth do not know what is going on today. The Sustainable Development Goals are understood by these young people that are coming from our universities. And the reason why I'm very optimistic is that you have today as many graduate students coming out of universities from the south as probably the same as coming from the north. You have technologies that are accessible to young people. The apps that Mr. Gomez was talking about that are being developed by young people in Nairobi are really room for hope. And again, ladies and gentlemen, think about this country. Just in the early 70s, it was almost unbuilt. And why are we having our Global South-South Expo here? Because people of this country, and they are young, they're just as young as from any developing country, are able to actually develop themselves. So when we say South-South cooperation, it is real. Just 30 years ago, if you wanted to make a telephone call between Brazzaville and Kinshasa, two neighboring countries, just a river between the two, you had to dial Paris or Brussels before you come down to the other country. Today, with a cell phone, you can communicate almost anywhere in the world, from any village in the developing world. And the same will apply to renewable energy, because you don't need a grid. You can have off-grid solutions. So the hope is there. And I think when we talk about South-South cooperation, it is real. It is not only trade. It is happening all over. It is actually in agriculture. It is on medicine. Today, doctors are being trained in India or in South Africa, not in Europe anymore, or in the United States. So I think it is important to recognize that progress and to say that, yes, it is possible to do it. And yes, we can do it.
I think Dr. Alwa is going to have the last word.
I just wanted to comment just a few words that technology transfer and having to know how the experiences, so the use of social media, the use of new applications, which are smart applications, these are all ways now that will facilitate just circulating the best practices over the South-South countries. And in this regard, we made sure that we have an application developed specifically for this event by Zayed Foundation, so that there is live coverage for all of the sessions, and the youth are participating as well in 2 of the solution forums from internationally and the national level. So they are discussing, not only just listeners or volunteers, but they are, as panelists, will participate in our solution forums as well. So this is an opportunity that we are celebrating today with the changing priorities worldwide with the technology. Thank you.
Okay, with that, I have to stop the panel. I wish I could have gone on longer. I think we have great advocates of South-South cooperation. And it's obvious that it is of value and it is here to stay. And it's just for us to make sure that the goods and the good of it is spread evenly. I'm going to stop now and present my panel. Don't run off, please. Sit, with a certificate of appreciation, okay? So I'm going to do that, right? So don't run. Oh, yes, well,
Okay. Thank you very much, Deputy Director of the UN Office for South-South Cooperation, Inyang Ebong Hastrup. Thanks also to all the discussants for this very stimulating high-level leadership roundtable